I thought the hard part was going to be New York. There's so many interviews to do. And in a kinetic environment like that, your memory is going to be not reliable. So how to piece that together, I thought was going to be the biggest challenge. That turned out not to be true. The biggest challenge was figuring out that the story of the air defense had been concocted and did not reflect what the primary source material that we ultimately got told us.
Hi, I'm Mike Hurley.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
And we're the hosts of the Are We Safer Today podcast. In this podcast, we speak with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their unique experiences in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks.
The 9/11 Commission was chartered by Congress to investigate the most significant attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Supporting the work of the commissioners, the commission's staff was tasked with reconstructing a complex jigsaw puzzle. What led to 9/11? What happened on that day? What should we do about it? But unlike a typical jigsaw puzzle, the pieces were not in a box. There was no image of what the solved puzzle would look like, and many of the pieces were missing. I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley, and this is the Are We Safer Today podcast. John Farmer and his team are the perfect example of how difficult this task was. John and his teammates' piece of the puzzle involved reconstructing a minute-by-minute chronicle of the response of different government agencies, federal, state, and local, on the day of the attack. It was fog of war. It was confusion. It was shock. Communication systems failed. What happened in those minutes and hours that the American public should know and that history should record? John was uniquely qualified to solve this puzzle. On the day of the attacks, he was the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey. Farmer's career has spanned service in high-profile government appointments, private practice in diverse areas of criminal law, and teaching and law school administration.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org.
We would like to thank the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
Well, John Farmer, welcome to the Are We Safer Today podcast. As you know, we're speaking with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their experience in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks. Can you tell us a little bit about what your assignment was on the commission?
Yeah, my most important assignment for the commission was basically to reconstruct the day of, and to provide a comprehensive and accurate timeline of what happened and who decided what when, ranging from, President Bush down to the streets of New York and the field in Pennsylvania. So it was a daunting assignment, and then it sort of morphed into two other things, which was take a look at the state of preparedness as of when the commission was meeting and do an evaluation of that. So we had a hearing in New York about that issue and the issue of the private sector controlling so much of our critical infrastructure and what standards should apply to the private sector. And then to make recommendations to improve emergency response in similar crises.
So your work led to what became Chapter 1 of the report. And I will tell you that every time I read that chapter, I turn the page and keep thinking, maybe it will turn out differently this time. And so it is so haunting. And so I'm interested, we've got a lot more questions about background and things, but I'm so interested in what kind of impact did that have on you and your team going over those details of what happened that day and the misses and the not misses and all of that? I mean, it had to be just overwhelming at times.
Yeah, it was. And, there were aspects of it that were very raw. There are aspects of it, frankly, in the New York area that are still raw. When you talk to the firefighters and the police about, who was responsible for what, and with the members of our team having experienced it. I mean, I was in office on 9/11 myself. I was the Attorney General of New Jersey at the time, and every Attorney General's office is structured differently. By dint of the way we're structured, I was in charge of the state police who are in charge of emergency management. So, I spent the last several months of my tenure as AG around ground zero, helping victims, assigning state police to help the FBI with the ongoing investigation. And so when you're the top law enforcement officer of a state and you lose 800 people in one day who are murdered, that's a tough thing to swallow. And it really left me, after my tenure ended, wondering, like the rest of us, like, what the F happened? How did this happen? And so when Governor Kane called and gave me the opportunity to be involved in finding the answers to those questions, I leapt at it.
John, every American recalls where they were, who was live then, where they were and what they were doing on September 11, 2001. Can you share where you were and what you were doing and what your immediate reaction was?
Yes, I was the Attorney General of New Jersey on that day. I spent the morning down in Atlantic City. We were actually hosting a national conference focusing on the relationship between police and minority, particularly black communities, because a lot of my tenure as Attorney General had been spent in dealing with the racial profiling scandal, which enveloped New Jersey before it spread to the rest of the country. And I had spent a good part of my tenure being a shuttle diplomat between the Black Ministers' Council, the Black Issues Convention, and law enforcement, trying to sort of create a bridge. And I thought we'd made a lot of progress, actually. So we decided to have this conference. Started on 9/10, and we had people sitting on panels together who weren't on speaking terms a few years earlier. So the evening of 9/10, I remember saying to my first assistant, boy, this is looking like a smooth glide path home. And then, of course, got up on 9/11, was walking across the convention center to kick off the day, and then my pager went off, as everybody else's did. And I called the home office, and they said, you got to get in front of the television. Because it was probably the first plane had hit at 8:46, so it was probably 10 of 9. So I ran over just in time to see the second plane hit and realize that we were really under attack. And so we basically raced up to State Police Headquarters and then took a helicopter over to Ground Zero. We staged across the river on the New Jersey side. These were plans that were put in place for the millennium. I don't know if anyone remembers Y2K and all these expected things that might happen. And we were briefed by the FBI, and it's the first time I remember hearing the name Osama bin Laden, someone who might threaten the United States on the millennium. So we had plans in case Lower Manhattan were attacked. That's where we would stage. We would set up a mobile trauma center and help them. So that's what I was doing that morning.
You yourself knew so many people, and you had responsibilities that morning. Did you ever worry about your own ability to sort of address these? I know from my perspective, I had a very good friend that was on the flight that went into the Pentagon, and so I was investigating her murder. And so I know it affected me. How did that personal thing, that's not usually what you do in an investigation.
Yeah, it was, it gave me a little bit of a pause. I guess my curiosity sort of overwhelmed my hesitation. And, yes, absolutely. I probably went to 40 funerals after 9/11, maybe more than that, most of which were either were first responders. The chief of the Port Authority Police had been a New Jersey state trooper, so all of his friends were people I knew, and I knew him. Again, I thought it was a way to sort of pay homage to them, to be involved in this. The only times when I wasn't able to sort of put it in perspective was when I thought people were either not taking us seriously, which happened at the beginning, or just treating it like an annoying thing that we were asking, as opposed to, this is a really important event in our history and we need to find out what happened. That part, I probably was more angry than I would have been if I hadn't been involved.
Can you talk a little bit about that very beginning when there wasn't a lot of attention paid? I think the commission's very first hearing was in New York City, and the audience was, I think, me. I mean, there was very few people, and we just weren't getting the kind of attention. How did you turn that around?
I think just the course of events turned that around, and the leadership of the commissioners. I was at the first hearing. I actually was recovering from pneumonia at that first hearing, so I remember it vividly. And it was about the air defense story. And that was going to be, I dragged myself in there because I thought, I'm going to have to write this, so I'd like to hear what they have to say. And so they set it forth, and I remember thinking, well, that part's going to be easy. We already have the testimony. And it wasn't under oath, which was a decision that was made. But, it was comprehensive. They had a timeline, and everything was set forward. I thought the hard part was going to be New York. There's so many interviews to do and so many different, and in a kinetic environment like that, your memory is going to be not reliable. So how to piece that together, I thought, was going to be the biggest challenge. That turned out not to be true. The biggest challenge was figuring out that the story of the air defense had been concocted and did not reflect what the primary source material that we ultimately got told us.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Philanthropic Foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. And the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
So you talked about how, you thought it was going to be simple and easy, the air defense piece, because you already had this testimony. How did you figure out that it wasn't accurate? I mean, as a former prosecutor, you're trying to figure out when someone's not telling you the truth, and in the movies you see someone sweating profusely, or you've got the light, where were you on the night of whatever? And how did you determine that this was a bunch of nonsense?
It was more gradual than you see depicted in movies. It was, we initially did not subpoena any documents. We sent out document requests and requests for materials, and we got the answers back. And among the questions we asked were, you always want to find out what's out there, what kind of primary source material exists. And so we got the answers back, and the answers were, very little. And we specifically asked about tapes, and they sent us a partial transcript of one position up at the Northeast Air Defense Sector in Rome, New York, which is part of the overall air sovereignty mission of the Air Force. So we had partial tape that didn't make a whole lot of sense, and then these representations that's all they had. We thought it was a little odd because the testimony had been so specific. I thought they're going to give us the documents, we can just validate what they said, and that will be, we can write that part, we'll be done in 3 months. Then we started, it really sort of hit home when we went out into the field and we went to Rome, New York. Again, you're on site then, so the first thing you ask is, not what happened, what do you have? What's here? Like, show us what's here. And we realized that there were, behind every position, there was someone taking notes of what was happening. And so, where are those notes? Those notes, those logs would be a really contemporaneous record of, as things evolved, what happened. So it turned out they had those notes. And I noticed that the first people we talked to, I forget their positions, but they basically told us, well, everything's recorded. And I said, oh, really? Where are those tapes? Well, it's reel to reel, it's really old, it might not work, blah, blah, blah. So at that point, I thought they were just flipping us off. Basically, that's the feeling I had. So I actually stopped the interviews and flew home and basically went to see Governor Kane at Drew University and said, we have to subpoena these people or they're just going to laugh at us.
And why was this important? Help our listeners understand why this air defense piece was important that morning.
It was important because the version that was relayed to the public gave a misleading impression about how effective the chain of command was that day. You had the first 2 planes that went to the Trade Center, and that was pretty straightforward. It was such a surprise that they had scrambled fighters out of Otis Air Force Base in New York, in Massachusetts, but they really couldn't get there in time to matter. But the way the narrative shifted was by the time of the 3rd plane, the national command structure was aware and was all linked up, and they were ready to respond, and they narrowly missed being able to intercept American 77. The plane hit the Pentagon, and they were lined up and ready to take out United 93 as it turned for Washington. The narrative with respect to those 2 planes just wasn't true at all. The communications were spotty. They couldn't find the planes. They didn't know about United 93 until after it had crashed. And so the effect of the concocted story was to give a misleading impression of exactly how well we functioned that day.
Did they really understand that they were giving you information that wasn't accurate, or was it that they hadn't listened or looked and they just wanted to tell the story they wanted to tell?
It's interesting because as you sort of went through the primary source material, the logs that were kept, clearly whoever had put the testimony together had seen those logs because there was information that was taken directly from those logs and not the rest of it. So somebody had seen what really happened and decided that was a bad story. You can understand that in the early days especially, where you're a little panicked about what might happen next. The last thing you want to do is go out there and say, hey, we were completely unprepared, dropped the ball, we didn't know what we were doing. But the testimony that was before Congress was almost a year later. On the anniversary, they had done the BBC had done this minute-by-minute documentary based on this account. So I think what happened was they put out an account that somebody knew was doctored early on and then decided they had to stick with it. I think that's what happened.
John, just to step back for a
Yep.
moment, your team's portfolio was multifaceted, and the story's so complex, so many things going on in so many different agencies, federal, state, local, and so much confusion. How did you even begin to organize how to tackle something like that? I mean, you had experience as a federal prosecutor and investigative experience, but that must have been a daunting challenge.
Yeah, figuring out exactly how to, and we have, like the whole commission staff, we were not legions of people, and figuring out who to assign to what. My initial sort of allocation of resources was I was going to work with Dana, Hyde, and Miles on the air defense story because I thought it would be very easy. And then the rest
turned out not to be.
The rest of the team was going to be concentrated in New York. As it turned out, the New York story, while it's complex, after a while it started falling into really neat buckets in terms of the towers and who was where, and so those interviews, while they were very emotional, the facts started falling into place. When it became clear that the air defense story was a little bit different, I pulled John Azzarello off the New York team, and he worked with us on the air defense story, along with Kevin Schaefer and Miles and Dana. And that was the team that basically traveled. We went to all the relevant air defense sector sites, and we also went to the relevant air traffic control sites in Boston, in Cleveland, Indianapolis, D.C., so there was a lot of travel involved, and I viewed my role as sort of being the one who could try to pull it together.
And you must have, your colleagues must have had to prepare meticulous timelines,
Yep.
minute by minute, of emergency response, for example, of the Air Force's response, of the Federal Aviation Administration's response,
Yep.
all these different things. Describe that process.
It was a matter of really keeping separate timelines for everyone we interviewed, and then trying to put them together to see if it all added up. And we were able to do that. And I have to say that the records that the military kept were fantastic. They were very accurate, and they didn't leave much. They had literally, and I think this is a great way to manage a situation like that. They literally had someone behind every important decision maker writing down everything he said and the time he said it. So it was not a hard story to put together. That's why I'm somewhat jaded about the explanation was, well, it was fog of war, which I'm sure is true, but it didn't have to be fog of war. In your memory, it might have been, but you had very objective evidence, very excellent primary source material from which to put the story together. And that's ultimately what assisted us in doing it.
You've talked about the response in New York and the challenges there. Did you see differences in the response at the Pentagon site versus what happened in New York?
It was a simpler event. And so there was a little early on that morning, there was a little bit of fighting over who had control of the scene. Was it the FBI? Was it the Pentagon police? Was it the Arlington police? There was any number of agencies.
Arlington, Virginia. And
yeah. I'd say fairly early on, they had established a chain of command, but it was a simpler event. You didn't have 210-story buildings down and 40-foot-high pile of burning debris with people trapped inside. It was a more organized response because it was an easier response. And there was still a lot of improvising going on. I mean, Kevin Schaefer, was basically saved by someone running in and carrying him out. And he wasn't a first responder. It was just a Marine who happened to be at the Pentagon that day. At every level, basically, the response that morning was improvised. And so you have to train people to be able to improvise, and people, the model that I like to cite is the way the Israelis handle terrorism, where they know you're not going to have time to go to the president of Israel to get authorization to shoot a terrorist. So their people are trained so that the authority rests at the level where the decision has to be made. And that's what has to happen in these situations. And that wasn't happening then. It was all top down. If everyone had played by the book, they never would have gotten the planes off the ground. I mean, the fact that the fighters were scrambled had nothing to do with the national command structure. It was people in Rome, New York saying, what the hell, we can't wait. They can tell me I'm wrong later. I mean, basically, let's scramble the planes now. And the same thing happened basically at every level of the crisis. Some extraordinary work done by air traffic controllers and the military controllers. And the issue was that the chain of command that had been established, the SOPs for responding to things, didn't really think through what would actually have to happen and where decisions would actually have to be made in order to be effective. So I think that's changed.
You know, you talked about how with the air defense folks that initially you weren't getting all the information and all of that. But you also ended up subpoenaing New York City, didn't you? Didn't you have similar issues of getting what you needed?
A similar dynamic. And in New York's case, and what they kept saying to us was, and this is still, I think this is still subject to a protective order of some kind. They had a lot of tapes, 911 calls and things like that, and they're horrific. So they were very concerned about our
privacy issues,
having a hearing and playing these gut-wrenching end-of-life tapes and sort of sensationalizing, people suffering. And that was a legitimate concern. And our concern was we are trying to piece together, who was where and what was being said and what was the level of awareness and what were people being told on those tapes.
Because even the tapes that were played at hearings, for example, some of those were gut-wrenching in and of themselves, and so I can only imagine.
They were mild.
Compared to...
you had people talking about people jumping, and, I have a vivid memory of being with George Del Grosso, who was on our team. He was a retired homicide detective from New York. And Sam,
what was his part? What was his role?
He was an investigator for us in New York. And Sam Casperson, who was also on our team, as a lawyer on our team. This is what I remember. I think it was Christmas Eve. We were in the New York City offices listening to these tapes. I'll never forget it. It was a very, very emotional. And it will be when they're ultimately released. I don't know what they're planning to do. I don't think they're ever going to just say, here they are. I think they're going to wait for people to ask them in Freedom of Information Act requests or something.
I just know from my days as a prosecutor, there are days you went home after dealing with a case that just was so wrenching that you... how did you deal with it?
I guess the same way that, that I dealt with it as a prosecutor. Like, okay, this is really upsetting, but it has to be done. Just sort of put your head down and say, listen, we're doing a public service here. I think they became convinced after a point that we were not trying to sensationalize this at all. And we were simply trying to get an understanding of who had situational awareness when. And we wrote the New York chapter sort of very matter-of-factly.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. And the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
The commission had subpoena power, and it was always kind of there on the shelf in the background, there to be used if necessary. I think your team may have been the only one that really had to rely on it. On a couple of occasions, we've already talked about that you had to raise it. Were you generally supported by the commissioners and when you felt that this was
they never said no.
necessary?
They never said no when we asked. I remember the New York subpoena, there was a commission dinner at Keene University, at Drew University rather. And I interrupted their dinner and just said, just so you know, I had reached this agreement with Counsel of New York, but they need a subpoena. Does anyone have a problem? They said no. I was a little more worried about the DOD and DOT subpoenas because...
DOT, Department of Transportation.
And Department of Defense, because, we had heard that Secretary Rumsfeld was really against getting subpoenaed.
He was a Secretary of Defense at the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he was actively courting, I think, the commissioners. And so I was a little worried about that one. And I wasn't sure how much Philip Zelikow really wanted to do that. The concern was if you subpoena them and they litigate it, it could really slow us down, and that's absolutely valid concern. I thought it was outweighed by just the evidence that they were just not taking us seriously enough.
I think, John, what you ran into, that other teams ran into for a time as well, too, that is in the early days of the commission's work, that it wasn't necessarily taken all that seriously. Just another government commission. Yep. We've already had the congressional inquiry into us. We've had our own inspectors general looking at possible mistakes and failures and shortcomings. This is just another one.
Yep, absolutely.
There's an overkill here. We have to be about our business and doing our work today.
Yes.
And leave us alone, kind of thing. And I think
how dare you prevent us from doing our jobs? There was one story in the New York Times where it was about our issue area. And Philip, it was a Sunday afternoon, and Philip, we had a conference call, and he said, "This is just youth. This can't happen." And I said, "I know that wasn't us." And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because this isn't right."
John, I know that you're an expert on what transpired on United 93, and I'm sure that listeners want to know something about that story and your perspective on it. What happened on United 93?
So United 93 was an interesting case because there was a delay in the actual attack in the cockpit in that flight, which we've never.
So United 93 is the plane that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
That's good. Yes, it was the fourth flight. It took off from Newark, and it was hijacked somewhere beyond Pittsburgh and ultimately crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Unlike the other three flights, the timing had to do with as soon as the pilot turns off the seatbelt sign, that's when you go. Well, that happened in 93, and nothing happened. There are all kinds of conjectures. We were that the proposed pilot of that flight may have been, he was one of the more westernized people and had a fiance, and so there's some speculation that maybe he ultimately didn't really want to do this.
This is one of the terrorists.
Yeah, I think it was Hani Hanjour, I think. He could check me on that. There's no proven account for why they delayed. They didn't attack the cockpit immediately, and so it drifted.
When that seatbelt sign went off.
That went off, and it was clear sailing, and so the question is, why did they do it when they did it? That's again nothing that has been provable, so it's not in our report. I have my own conjecture, which is that United you could actually listen to the air traffic, and around 9:23 or so, there was a message over air traffic about do you know about the situation in New York, and they didn't say hijacking, but if they were listening. And there's also something in D.C., and so
they may have hesitated.
So I think that's what triggered them. I think they realized, okay, it's happened in New York. If we're going to do this, we better do it now because it's going to be too late. But 9:28 is when they actually breached the cockpit, and you can hear. And now, if you go to the 9/11 Memorial in Shanksville, they have all this stuff that we had to fight for is now available to the public. You can actually hear the entire sequence. You can hear the murder of the stewardess. You can pretty much hear them murdering the pilot and the co-pilot. And they also have the tapes that we listen to of the passengers calling home or calling the airlines or trying to call the Secret Service. And, all these things were happening. It's very gratifying to me that when you go to the Shanksville Memorial, the story that they set forth is the story that we established.
Based on your timeline.
Yep.
And so the passengers on United 93 were alerted in calls that they made to their loved ones on the ground, and they learned about the attacks on the World Trade Center.
Yes.
Maybe some were even tuned into the United radio, sort of.
It's possible. So 9:28, the hijacking happens. 9:33 or 9:34, the controller in Cleveland notifies FAA, the Regional Operations Center in Herndon. So FAA has knowledge in 9:33, 9:34. And then it gets lost in the FAA, and they don't notify the military until after the plane has crashed at 10:06. That's a true bureaucratic failure that day that happened. At FAA headquarters, it was very confused by all accounts. The people were running around doing different things. I would say that's one of the few agencies that really didn't perform that well that morning. They had notice, and they just lost what they were supposed to do.
And how do we know that the passengers on United 93 fought back?
A couple of them said to their spouses, we're going to do something. We're planning something. We're going to go up. We now know that we're not surviving this unless we take the plane over. So, the issue was, did they ever breach the cockpit? And the answer is no. They tried.
Or they never or breached the cockpit.
Yeah, they never got in there because you could hear the two of them talking and saying, "Let's turn the plane over. Let's put it in the ground." And I think they crashed where they did because they were afraid they weren't going to make it to Washington.
I sort of had the experience. I was looking at the FBI, and
I remember.
Yes, and you can remember. You know that the FBI, you're not coming to interview me. But we found when we went to field offices, people were upset if they weren't on the list to be interviewed. They sort of felt that they wanted their story to be told. Over time, did you sort of see that happen?
Yep. Once we sort of got everyone's attention, and they realized this was going to be history. Then more people wanted to be interviewed and really, didn't want to be left off the list. I'm very satisfied that the story we told is the truth, and I don't think that we missed anything. At the end of the day, we got the primary source material that we found existed. New York ended up cooperating with us. They weren't necessarily happy all the time, but they did. So I felt at the end of the day very confident that the story that we put together is the right one.
John, did your team investigate questions like why did Building 7, which was the smaller building on the World Trade Center, collapse? Because I know there were there's lots of conspiracy theories, but that never should have collapsed. It was impossible that collapsed and things like that.
So we had no technical expertise on the team, but we did work with NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they were doing a comprehensive.
It's a government agency.
Yes, a government agency, and they were doing a comprehensive look at those kinds of issues. What they told us, which made sense to me, was that Building 7 actually was a repository for all the fuel that was going to keep the Emergency Operations Center going, and that once that ignited, the building was going to come down. And that makes sense to me. And I think some of the conspiracy theories arose because people had a sense that they weren't being told. I think government gets itself in trouble by trying to spin things too much. And that just makes your mind race when they find out, oh, well, that wasn't right what they told us. And what else weren't they telling us? And it's a very destructive kind of cycle you get into. But I remember the families came in, in New York one time to talk to us about, that it was a cruise missile that hit the Pentagon. And on a plane, it just helped having Kevin there, who basically said, "You want to smell my breath? You can smell the jet fuel."
One of the conspiracy theories I remember was that there was supposedly video at Logan Airport that Mohammed Atta, or one of the hijackers, had been casing the airport like weeks before the attacks, and that crops up in the news every once in a while.
That's not something we were able to corroborate. It's true that the hijackers were flying a lot, and they were in flying a lot. They were studying the aircraft. No doubt, they were trying to figure out what the best style of attack would be, and what flights would be less full, and things like that. But I don't think I never saw that video, if it exists, of him casing the airport. And if he had been casing the airport, I think the other unexplained thing is, why did he go to Maine first? And then it seemed like he thought he had figured out that if he went through security in Maine, he wouldn't have to go through it in Logan Airport. And then when he had to, he was visibly pissed off.
You've authored a book on your team's work and your work. Just say a little bit about that.
It was basically, there wasn't room in the report to sort of tell the story of why we thought the narrative that was told was just knowingly, not true. And so I decided to do it, to tell that story as a separate freestanding work. And so that's what I did. Basically what I've talked to you about today is what's in that book. What's in our report is just the facts, which is the right thing to do. And I give Kane and Hamilton so much credit for insisting that the report be written that way, almost like straight reporting.
And your book is Ground Truth.
Ground Truth, yeah.
Ground Truth, I remember.
That's the term everybody kept using. Well, I'll tell you, the ground truth is X.
So you gave us the ground truth. What 9/11 Commission recommendations grew out of your team's work?
So there were several. Fundamentally, the recommendation that the nation's first responders adopt the incident command system so that there isn't this turf war going on while there's a crisis going on, and that in many crises has been adopted. It hadn't been by the time of Hurricane Katrina, and it was a catastrophe in the terms of chain of command and total chaos. But in Deepwater Horizon, absolutely, they had adopted it for that. That was the oil spill in the Gulf. So incident command system was one. The setting aside, dedicating bandwidth to emergency response was another. Another one was we had discovered that 85% of the critical infrastructure in our country is controlled by the private sector. So we went back and forth with the commissioners about this, but we ultimately recommended that NIST had basically set forth some basic standards of preparedness for buildings and enterprises. We recommended that those standards be adopted as a standard of care for private sector. So in other words, standard of care is if you don't observe the standard of care, you can be sued for negligence. That's been pretty widely adopted it was adopted first by DHS and then by a lot of state agencies around the country. I think that's why the Commission's report has been so successful, that the recommendations grew out of the findings. And Kane and Hamilton, I think, did a great job, and Philip
Zellico, the executive director.
Chris Gojum.
And it was just, it did work. It could easily have failed. I'm not sure it's possible today to do what we did because the partisanship is running so deep And there was partisanship running through that staff. I mean, you could tell there were friction points with certain people, but everyone was able to put it to the side because of the leadership. And even among the commissioners, there were some hard partisans on both sides, and they were able to put that behind them.
John, you've touched on some of this, but some of the folks who are going to be listening to this podcast weren't born on September 11th, 2001. And what might you say to them in particular about the legacy of the commission and its value?
I talk to those people every day because they're my students. And it's a jarring thing to realize that they don't remember 9/11. And so they have no reason to really focus on the commission report very much. But they've grown up in the world that was shaped by both the attacks themselves and the reaction to our report.
So do you think we're safer today?
Safer from an attack like 9/11, yes. Safer as a country, no. Because the threats have multiplied. Terrorism's still a threat. Al-Qaeda's still out there somewhere. ISIS is out there somewhere. You also now have the emergence of political extremist terrorism that's domestic. The sort of poisoning of the public square that's occurred. Our system is set up so that if you are unwilling to compromise, the system won't work. And that's, to me, the biggest threat that we face is that. You have to compromise for our government to work.
You've been a leader in and devoted significant time to protecting vulnerable communities from terrorists. Just say a word about that effort.
So, yeah, this is something that was sort of an outgrowth of being dean of the law school at Rutgers for a few years and getting to know a really generous donor we shared an interest in the reality that something like over 1 billion people now are living in parts of the world where they're not ethnically from. And so you, by definition, have a world of vulnerable populations. He's funded these efforts, and a lot of it has to do with improving the relationship between police and vulnerable populations, because frequently they don't even know they're there until there's a mass shooting. So, and the common thread is that these communities are somewhat isolated, and they isolate themselves, but they're also isolated from law enforcement, and so there's no way to even know where the threats are coming from. So I've been focused on that issue. It's sort of combining the sort of 9/11 lessons that I've learned with my experience as AG dealing with racial profiling.
Well, John, in addition to being so insightful, this conversation has brought back a lot of personal memories and memories of how we all work together. And thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
It's great to see you guys again.
Yeah, take care. John's work in documenting the government response on the day of was a searing look at how poorly our government was prepared to respond to the attacks. In the next episode of the Are We Safer Today podcast, we'll be hearing from the man who headed the team that investigated the details of the 9/11 hijacking plot.
Mohammed Atta, who is the leader of the hijackers in the United States, was sent to Miami to meet Katani's plane, his flight. However, due to some very alert work by an INS inspector, Katani was turned away. He was not admitted to the country. So there would have been the 20th hijacker.
Dieter Snell will be our guest, and we'll dive into a critical piece of the 9/11 puzzle. Who were the terrorists? How did they get into the United States, evade detection in some cases for almost 2 years? Who else was involved in the plot? And what help did they get inside the U.S.? Join us as we continue to explore through the eyes of investigators the most extensive investigation in U.S. history.
Thank you for listening to the Are We Safer Today podcast. This was made possible thanks to our sponsors, Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Wilson Center.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to check out the Are We Safer Today documentary film. In it, the 9/11 commissioners discussed their historic work, what they did and how they did it. Available in broadcast or streaming from your local public television station or pbs.org/video. Special thanks to the Center on Representative Government at Indiana University, along with Paul and Cindy Simon Scott and the Sumerian Foundation. Are We Safer Today is a production of Naptown Media. Executive producer Bob Massey. Produced by Shelby Hiltunen with associate producer Emily Twergel. editors Matt Massey and PJ Wilson. Recorded at Interface Media Group in Washington, D.C. with sound engineer Dennis Jacobson. Thanks to Sarah Jackson and Grant McPollen. Theme music by House Music and Sound.